Hi. Hi, Judy. Hi,
Hi.
everyone.
We're looking at owners window there. 1 second. Um, I want to welcome Rini and Ashwin from the BioHealth Innovation Team who've worked on a number of successful SBIR applications, MIPS applications, and MII through TEDCO too. So using their experience, starting with folks who've never applied for an SBIR before, to many who have won and are doing resubmissions or phase two submissions, we're going to let them have the floor and share their tips for winning applications. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy. And thank you, everyone, for holding on till now from the morning. And so today, Ashwin and I will be talking about some tips for preparing a strong application. And, I think one thing we'll like to say before we start is that there is no one definite way of preparing a strong application. And there are many ways to write a good application that could win an SBIR. And this will be largely focused on SBIRs, but we will be happy if you would like to reach out to us. Our emails are here. Reach out to us after this presentation, and we'll be happy to chat further. As you've heard a lot this morning from different program officers from all the different institutes, it's always recommended to start early. We always recommend 3 to 4 months ahead of the deadline. And that's just because it takes a lot more time than one would expect to prepare a strong application. First, we would always recommend you start with registrations, which could be a very lengthy process in completion. So start early and you can get that squared away before you get started with your application process. And then it's going on to identifying opportunities and which institutes you're going to apply for. It could be NIH, NSF, DOD, like the many that we've heard today. And are you applying to an omnibus, which is an open application for different subject matters, or would you be looking for a specific call for application? And that can be found on the internet, and please feel free to reach out to us or your program officers. Also, the other thing that was mentioned many times this morning was, should you go for a phase 1, a phase 2, or a fast track? And as the program officers have alluded to, a lot of that depends on where your technology is, how much preliminary data you have, and really just the technology readiness level. And that's something that BHI and us can help you make a decision on or support you with some advice. In terms of timeline, something that we've done with companies is also to provide some sort of project management during the whole application, because we understand that some companies do not have the bandwidth to support the whole application process. Lastly, why do you need a lot of time to prepare? It just takes really a lot of time to prepare logistics for a strong application. You really want to gather a strong team with different subject matter experts. You want to prepare your preliminary data and present that well. You want to gather partners, collaborators that could take time to source. You want to put together a strong budget that would fit not only the budget cap, but also the different criteria that it has to fit. And lastly, you would want to gather letters of support that will show how strong of a business you are. So moving on after this general overview slide, we would like to share with you some common aspects that we've seen across grants that have won or are really strong. So from the basics, how can we build a strong case for our grant? The number one question is always, what is the problem that you're solving? And this ties into the significance and unmet need. And building a narrative around that is always quite easy for most people because you understand what you're trying to solve. So I think we'll try to focus a little bit more on the other aspects. Innovation is something that has been repeated a lot of times today, and that the SBIR is focused on innovative projects. And we've seen that quite a few people struggle with bringing out the innovative aspects of the technologies. Simply stating that something is novel is typically not enough. And how we'd like to help you here is try to point you to how you could bring the innovations out. So one of them could be technical differentiators, and that ties into your preliminary data. So you could use your preliminary data to back your innovation and your technical aspects of innovation. Another could be market differentiators, and this could be the aspects of your technology that is advantageous or is novel over existing products or competing products in development. Something that was also brought up, especially for the NSF opportunities, is the commercial opportunity. And while we're focusing more on phase ones today, so we're not talking deeply about the commercialization plan, which was already discussed earlier on, it's always important to know what your commercial opportunity is. Again, because this is a small business grant, you definitely want to understand what your market size and segment is, especially what your first target segment would be. And you would want to also discuss some competitors and, as I previously mentioned, some differentiators of your product compared to your existing or developing competitors. And if it's applicable, you will want to discuss your business model. So one tip would be, think of this as an investor pitch, and you will really want to build a strong case that would be able to convince someone to give you money and that your project is worth investing money in and that would generate some sort of return. So think of it in a similar fashion, and this is how we typically try and help people understand why is it so important to focus on the innovation behind your product. And moving on to the scientific strategy and technical plan. So we never want to lose focus that the SBIR is a research project in essence, and it would be expected that your grant has to have the same categories of any research project. So first thing that we've touched on a little bit was preliminary data and specific aims. So you really want to narrate your preliminary data well and discuss what you've done so far, where is your technology at this stage, and what you would like to achieve with funding, which is then the specific aims. Details are expected. We often see many grants that are lacking details and it's written in a very vague fashion. So this is not how you want to write it. You want to really put in as many details as possible to convince reviewers that you have a clear plan of how to proceed once you have been funded. So I like to think about it as who's going to do the work. Is it going to be you or your collaborators or outsourced? What is going to be done, exactly the steps that will be done, and again, be very specific about what is going to be done, why you would do this, and how it's going to contribute to development of your product or your project, how you're going to do it, where and when. So timeline is also really important. Very often the research team is very useful in developing all of the details and putting it. And from there, be sure to have scientific rigor when you're explaining your plan of action. Oftentimes, it's very useful to have measurable outcomes because a reviewer would be looking to see how you would understand whether your project would be successful or not. So giving them very measurable forms of milestones and goals would be a good target to reach when you're conducting your aims. And of course, we know that nothing is without challenges. And although you might not foresee any challenges, you still want to include one or two potential pitfalls that you might encounter while you're going through your project and coming up with alternative solutions for them if it does not go well. So a pro tip here would be to look at scientific publications. If you look at scientific publications, the methods are always written in a way that an external party can just replicate the whole project without additional input. So this is how they would expect to see a research grant proposal. So you really want to describe in detail how and with what you're gonna carry out your research aims with. So we always focus on the writing, and there's no way around this. And we always suggest to edit, and edit again. One thing that I would like to focus on is the use of figures, tables, and diagrams. We know that every grant proposal has a page limit. For phase 1 is 6 pages, and for phase 2 or fast track is 12 pages. And always use figures, tables, and diagrams to your advantage. We've seen some grants with figures that are really small, and that really is not a great use of a figure and not great use of space as well. If you could replace a chunk of text better with a figure, then please go ahead. Also, something that the program officer mentioned this morning was that not all reviewers will read your entire grant in detail. So perhaps it might be easier to put a diagram for them to have one glance and understand your entire project. So again, a picture tells 1,000 words sometimes, but please use it wisely and to your advantage. Another thing that we would like to focus on is clarity of language and organization. Again, because not all reviewers would be reading every single word in your grant, and not all of them will be the exact expert that you might be an expert in, not in your field. They might be a general expert within the therapeutic area. So you would really want to curate the grant in a way that is still highly technical, but it's in an accessible manner for perhaps not a specific expert would understand. Alluding to the page limit, please write concisely. That always helps. We've seen some grants with very, very long sentences that goes on for paragraphs and filled with technical jargon and separated by commas or semicolons. And that sometimes just makes it very difficult for a reviewer who might be reviewing 10 to 20 grants a day to read and understand. Again, I think having professional grant reviewers take a look at your grant always helps. That's something that we at BHI do, especially if it's an external party who's giving you feedback. It always provides them with a fresh pair of eyes, and it also removes bias, because you might have been working on your grant or your project for many years and you are really personally invested. However, you might be missing out on some of the challenges that your grant might be presenting that you are not seeing. So with that, I will turn it over to Ashwin.
Yeah, so coming to like the end of a grant cycle, one of the things we always say, do you want me to present it? Oh, okay.
Here.
One of the things we always talk about is don't expect an SBIR to be won on the first go, right? This is a process that you kind of have to go through in terms of submitting, getting the feedback from the grant reviewers, and going back and submitting again with a more high quality proposal based on what they consider to be weaknesses, right? So you definitely want to consider what you're going to do once you get that feedback back and you are ready to apply the next time, right? And usually that you're not going to have much time with at least the NIH cycle, right? You're going to have about a month or less to get the summary statement, read it critically, and make the changes in your grant. So at that point in time, you want to do exactly what Rini said in the beginning, right? Make sure your logistics and timing are on point. Make sure you coordinate with your partners, get any updated budgets, reviews from them, and you have to kind of do that in a timely fashion if you want to get the next iteration. So addressing the summary statement, right? When you resubmit a grant, you typically have one page in NIH grants, one page to address revisions in your resubmissions, right? And the way you're going to do this is by looking at the summary statement, reading it critically, and really understanding what the criticisms are, and being able to consolidate that into a bit of a narrative that you will put in that one page, as well as throughout the body of your grant. So when you're doing that, you want to kind of make sure you understand what the reviewers are saying. And reviewers are not perfect. Like Rini said, they're looking at a lot of grants. Not everything they say is gospel in those summary statements, right? So the kind of things you want to look at is the criticism repeated across multiple reviewers, right? You might have one or two reviewers here that have, actually all the time, they have different perspectives, right? They'll have different opinions about your grant, sometimes radically different. But you do want to see if there's any repeated criticisms that show a systemic kind of weakness or lack of understanding across the reviewers in your grant, right? Two, you want to see, will addressing a particular criticism really affect the entire scope of your grant, right? Sometimes you can make a small change that will satisfy the reviewers, or making that change is going to dramatically change the logistics, the budget, how you're going to practically execute the grant. And that's not always the best thing to do when you have a limited amount of time, and sometimes it won't even make sense from an execution perspective. So look at that critically and think about how you want to actually address that when it comes to changing the language or changing the approach, which comes to, is the criticism practically addressable, right? Not every reviewer, I love, the reviewers are great, right? All the reviewers who've been on and talked are great, but they don't always give feedback that is necessarily required to be changed to improve the quality of your grant. Sometimes they're just giving their own thoughts and opining a little bit, right? You have to be judicious about what criticism you take and actually that can actually be practically changed in your proposal. And same, is the criticism informed and specific? Sometimes reviewers make comments that are simply incorrect. If the grant was read a little bit more carefully, it wouldn't, that criticism wouldn't have been made, right? And that comes back to the fact that they're reading a lot of grants. And in those situations, you just have to make sure that you reiterate that point in your resubmission and make sure that they are able to see it, and be respectful, right? Always be respectful when you're responding to any of these comments. They're looking at a lot of grants. They're not going to be perfect. Do your best to provide them the information, even if they got something wrong, in a respectful fashion. And so one thing is to, like, what do you do if you're not discussed, and how do you get to discuss, right? And I think this kind of goes in general with, what do you do if you're kind of unsatisfied with or you don't see a lot of promise from the scores that you got? And one thing is definitely always continue to generate data and advance the prototypes of whatever your technology is, right? It's a lot of the time you are looking for money to do those things, but in many cases you've built this technology, or you've advanced it using other resources and funds, and you don't really want to ever stop that. And I think that goes in line with what the SBIR program really is meant to do. It's not meant to solely fund your business. It's just not designed that way. You need to be pursuing your business as you would a business, right? It's not all about the SBIR. Make sure you're pursuing other funds and finding ways to continue to advance the actual technology. And as you gather that data, it will be useful to put back into the next iterations of the grant. So when you're putting the grant together, submitting it, waiting for the resubmission, you should be advancing that technology as fast as you can, generating new data that you can put in. And also, in that line of thinking, build business traction, right? Like Rini said, it's a lot about building a story. Think of it as an investment pitch and trying to convince people to fund your business. When you have a strong network of advisors, investors who might be interested, KOLs who say this is important, those are all ancillary things around the technology that you're actually trying to convince them to fund, to build, that will give credibility to your business and show that it's a grant worth funding. And I think, to all these points, work with your program officer, right? They are your SBIR champion. They want you to win. We get a lot of questions saying, with some level of apprehension about approaching your program officer, saying, oh, we don't want to say the wrong thing. Is this very unclear? Should we ask this question? Should we ask that question? And you don't really have to have those concerns. They want to give you money. They want to fund people who are trying their best to put forward great applications. So please be open with them and ask them any question you want, right? That they're there to help you put together a good application. In that sense, you should consider them as part of your team. And definitely make sure you discuss your summary statement right before you are resubmitting. Make sure you go through it in detail first by yourself, and then have a conversation with your program officer. They're always happy to do that with you, and make sure that your approach to resubmission and addressing criticisms are in line with what the program officer thinks is appropriate as well. And on this, so like we put our little BHI can help you things throughout the presentation, right? So what we can do that in a lot of different ways. We have monthly office hours that we'll sit for an hour and give you any advice you might need, right? It might be very abstract and informational, or you might have very specific information about a grant you're submitting or resubmitting or have partially developed, and we can give you advice on any of the above, right? And we also do grant strategy review and editing, as we mentioned. Depending on where you're located, we can do that with no upfront payment. And also we have EIR sessions that are, I don't know the exact schedule, but you can you can book it at the link below, and where we'll give you not so much specific on SBIRs, but overall the trajectory of your business. If you're wondering if you should make a decision in one fashion or another, getting some external feedback from a lot of experienced business professionals in the life science space, then that's usually very helpful for people to get a gut check on what they're doing. So, thanks, guys.
Thank you both. So I'm looking here to see if we have some questions. I want to thank you both, and you didn't get to talk about the fact that you have helped a large number of companies successfully win applications. So the tips that you shared are from experience. Do you want to quickly touch on that?
Sure, yeah. So we have worked with over 180 applications, and across SBIRs and STTRs, our success rate is about 40 to 50%. And as you have heard this morning from the NIH program offices and NSF, it's a typically 10% to 20% national average win. So, I would say that we have a slightly higher than average win rate. So that, like you said, our tips all came from experience and across all boards of different grants that we've seen.
And what I like about them is that they're practical. As you know, we've even today had a lot of questions during the NIH and NSF presentations, but where do we start? So if you've never done an SBIR before, and you go on the federal website and you're kind of lost, and we heard talks about going to Reporter and doing different things. Is that some of the guidance that you provide? And I'm being asked right now, how do you price things? What are the average costs for your assistants? Maybe you can explain, because that varies.
Sure, of course, yeah. It varies. You're right, Judy, and it really depends on how much help you'll need. If you're a first-time applicant that has never done an SBIR, don't know what an SBIR is, we do offer a full development program where we help you right from the beginning to even to grant writing if needed. And that really varies from, for example, a 10-hour review or a 1-hour review or a 1-hour session. So I would really encourage you to reach out to us, and we can really help you with personalizing the help that you might need. And sometimes, as I've said, this presentation will not be able to help with specific questions. And the best way we can provide help is really looking at your application and giving personalized help depending on your technology sector or your specific agency that you're applying to. So that will differ from company to company.
So to be clear, the SBIR, let's see, maybe you can throw those links back up, Rini or Ashwin.
Yeah.
The SBIR office hours take place monthly, virtually by Zoom these days. And that's free. And that's where you can bring your idea or project, Scott or anybody else, to Rini and Ashwin, and they'll review and figure out whether it is just 10 hours of review or 80 or 100 hours of full development, also the merits of it. And you heard all day long that program officers encourage you to speak with them before you move too far in the process. And Rini and Ashwin will join you on that first call with the program officer after they've met with you before signing a contract, just to help you have that conversation and see whether it makes sense from everybody's perspective to you move ahead. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the EIR office hours, which also are monthly, also are free. Both of them are supported by the sponsors for this event, Montgomery County, Maryland's Economic Development Corporation. What's the biggest challenge that you see when you maybe the top 3 challenges you see working with entrepreneurs who are trying to get SBIR funding? Either one of you.
I think so. The one thing is definitely the writing, like understanding how to write in a coherent fashion that properly addresses the business case and the technology approach, right? Just knowing how to craft your language well is not easy, right? And that's, I think, the biggest one of the biggest hurdles. And I think the other is knowing what you have in hand. Like, is your preliminary data, do you have appropriate data in hand to actually apply for an SBIR? Are you going to be competitive? That is another thing that is that it is not well seems not to be well known among entrepreneurs, right? So yeah, I think those are two of the biggest things we see.
And I think we heard Todd and a couple of the program officers talk about that too, is the preliminary data. As entrepreneurs, you have to be optimistic, right? And sometimes it's too optimistic and they're looking for the backup on that. There's another question or two about pricing and how much it would be for a 10-hour review. So, and maybe you can just describe what a 10-hour review is.
Well, we're not going to talk about the pricing here on this webinar, but definitely reach out to us. We're always happy to talk through that. And the reason is because we just do a lot of different types of projects depending on people needs. So it's better to talk about that on a separate call. But just to give a clarity on the 10-hour review, so that is really anything you need, right? Typically, we focus that around editing and consolidation of your text and language, right? That's where we feel is the most value anyone can get, right? Knowing we're not going to help you by restating what you already know about your technology or the market that you're entering, right? It's more about making sure that you can craft that in coherent language and make it concise, right? And keep it within the limits of pages and have there be proper flow. So I think that's where we kind of focus that 10 hours around, because that's the most value you can get as an applicant. But it really can be for anything you need, right? It can also be if you have some issues on the budget or you want to understand logistics or where you can pay for something or not, or what the breakdown should be. Any of those kind of logistical administrative things we can also help with too, right? And that can take time and be confusing as well.
And I know that you've helped some folks at the very beginning on strategy, what institute to apply to, or where, not just am I right with preliminary data, but is this novel enough, or what do you need? So I understand why you suggested that they reach out to you, and if you don't have your contact information here, we'll follow up with. I've also been asked if these slides will be available.
Yes, we will be able to share.
So we'll share the slides and the contact information, as I think we're going to be able to do with most of the sessions you've heard today. Rini, Ashwin, thank you very much for taking the time to prepare the presentation and share your expertise. And I encourage folks who want to get an extra assist and increase your win rate on SBIRs to sign up for one of the free office hours. We'll send you the slides with the contact information.